Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, or should I say, good evening, fratelli e sorelle, because we will hear more about the new encyclical, the new papal encyclical in a while by our keynote speaker who will give his comments, deliver his comments on this new encyclical by the Pope. My name is Stijn Datré. I'm the director of UXIA, the University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp. And as you can see there on the screen, we have a lecture series of webinars, or lectures in webinar form in the U-turn series. We call it U-turn because, of course, the COVID-19 crisis invites us to rethink, reshape our social thinking, our economic systems, ecological issues, and so on. They all have a place in this U-turn series. And if I may start quoting from the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, paragraph 7, we see that the Pope is confirming this need for a U-turn. I quote, "For all our hyperconnectivity, we witnessed fragmentation that made it more difficult to resolve problems that affect us all. Anyone who thinks that the only lesson to be learned was the need to improve what we were already doing or to refine existing systems and regulations is denying reality." So in that respect, I think the new encyclical is really inviting us to reflect on another world post-corona. Before I introduce you to the keynote speaker of tonight, I run through some technical details or some technical remarks. So if you have any technical issues, contact one of the moderators, Hilke Gunst or Nienke van Uffelen. You can send them a message in private chat. If you got problems with your browser, we strongly recommend Google Chrome in the most updated version. I have to recall you that this session is being recorded. It will be put on our website and so can be watched afterwards there. If you don't feel like receiving pop-up notifications during this webinar, please go to the button right-hand corner of your screen. It's a purple button. You can unfold there a menu, and then you go to the settings wheel, and there you can adjust your settings. And then last but not least, we kindly invite you, dear audience, to participate in this session, to be very active. And you can do that by posting your messages in the Q&A. You can find also in that purple menu at the bottom of your screen, you can find a text balloon, which guides you to the chat function, and also the Q&A chat for everyone, voor iedereen, chat to everyone. There you can post your questions to the keynote speaker of tonight. And so the moderator, Professor Hans Gijbels, will then select questions there and ask to the keynote speaker in the latest part of this 1 hour webinar. Okay, so then I'm very glad to have here Professor Francis Davies and Professor Hans Gijbels. We already had a very fruitful session this afternoon, an expert seminar on post-corona economics and the role of religion in this post-corona society and the economic value of religious initiatives. Tonight, as we said, we will focus on the papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, with a talk by Professor Davies entitled "We Are All Brothers and Sisters, Christianity, Social Justice and Civic Duty after Assisi 2020, but also after COVID-19, of course." Professor Francis Davies is a professor of religion, communities and public policy. He's director of policy at Edward Cadbury Center of the University of Birmingham, and he's also a professorial fellow at Oxford University. And the Q&A session will be moderated by Professor Hans Gijbels. He's founder of the Christian-inspired forum Logia. I've seen that there are some members of Logia present, so I welcome those. And coordinator, he is also of the research unit of pastoral and empirical theology of the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at KU Leuven. Professor Davies, may I kindly invite you to take the floor for a lecture of about 40 minutes. Thank you. Professor Davies, can you hear me? Probably you got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you very clearly. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here this evening, and only a pity that we can't be together in Belgium on the mainland in the few days that we have left as part of the European Union, which the Pope praises in the encyclical. But it's good to be here, and I think what I want to do tonight really is just throw out a series of thoughts to provoke a debate and to provoke a conversation, because it seems to me that to seek to tease out the deeper meaning of this encyclical is to enter into a series of kind of risky places. So risk number one seems to me is that the current context that we face in the church is a conflict of capitalisms and a conflict of cultures. On the one hand, and it's much misunderstood by commentators such as in the work of Austin Ivory and in Christopher Lamb more recently in the English-speaking countries, there's a deeply powerful strand of intellectual critical reflection coming out of America. And it's understood as merely right-wing and simply pro-neoliberal, pro the economic model, and in some way aligned with an unthinking and uncritical traditionalism. It seems to me to argue that is to miss some very important writing in the works of the age of theorists around that group of activists who have been accused of being in Rome, lobbying on the contents of this encyclical and trying to shape Vatican policy in other ways. If everyone goes back about 20 years deep into a beautiful collection edited by Scott Appleby at the University of Notre Dame, there's an essay by George Weigel, who's an eminent evangelical, neoconservative Catholic in this. And Weigel explicitly says that he is not a traditionalist. In fact, he goes out of his way in that essay to express grave reservation about the pre-conciliar traditionalists, and particularly to condemn them for their fear of democracy, and particularly to condemn them for their fear or their rejection of the Shoah and of anti-Semitism, which of course the Pope in this encyclical tackles head on, the solidarity with the Shoah. And Weigel goes on to argue that actually what happened at the council was not that the group of people won who were traditionalists, but that the council was modern and it was progressive. And in his interpretation, it was a victory for strands within powerful intellectual traditions within American Catholicism. And the defining issue that made sense of the council was the way that it adopted religious freedom, expressed no longer a fear of considering the joys and sorrows of the world and making them right through good economic activity. And so for Weigel, this represents the victory of John Courtney Murray's theorizing, the Jesuit American. And that what flows from that for him is not that there shouldn't be a renewal of the church and a renewal of its social mission, but for him, the American model and its vast American successes or economic successes and its democratic experiment and its radical individualism expressed in a kind of communitarianism in Weigel and say Michael Novak's accounts should be adopted for the vision of the church. And then in contrast, we have what you might call traditional social democrats, and the flip side of that coin in parts of mainland Europe, creative and traditional Christian democracy. With its social market perception of society, with its communitarianism, and with its personalism, and with its sense that whilst markets can cause flourishing, that when they fail, they need to be corrected. And that's the tradition that shaped many of the founders of the European Union, name-checked by Pope Francis in the encyclical, and of course a number of the parties throughout the mainland into Eastern Europe and for periods of time on other continents of the planet. But it seems to me a less known strand in the middle of there is the strand represented by Pope Francis himself. We get whiffs of it in his previous encyclicals and speeches, and we get a little bit of a whiff of it in the current encyclical, which is a strand heavily influenced by the non-liberation theology experience of South America, which wants to celebrate the possibility not only of a European Union over in Brussels, but a patria grande over in the continent of South America, which has profound reservations about markets, but doesn't have the most nuanced of analysis of bureaucracies and of state institutions and the way that they can be as inventive, in fact, if not more inventive, at recreating inequalities as market institutions can be. And that's certainly the experience of South America, and certainly well recognized in sociology and in development studies, to an extent that it calls into question some of the assumptions of the neutrality and automatic benevolence of state action that you found throughout, or that you find throughout the whole of the Catholic social encyclical traditions. So it's not surprising then that when notice was given to us that the Pope would be travelling to the hometown of St. Francis, to Assisi, where St. Francis took his downward journey, there was a debate on many continents as to what might be in this, and that since this publication has been published, well, as one commentator commentated or suggested, almost every government that's interested in these things thinks it's a criticism of them or a praise of them. And that seems to me to be a problem with encyclicals in general, that you can play a kind of a pick and mix, cover your own political backside, your own social backside, your own economic backside, to try and find the bits in each of them that suit you and don't suit you. What I want to do tonight is make a contribution to that social debate, really, by cutting across all of those arguments and those contestations, because it seems to me that what all of them represent is a model of analysis of the world where the world is at today, and a model and a series of proposals for solutions that may be stuck either in a bureaucratic tradition, in a social market tradition which is under huge pressure because of COVID, particularly at the moment, because it does rely on a functioning capitalist economy, and certainly that puts pressure on the neoliberal American model. So one way of looking at this document is from the outside, and then another way of looking at it is from the inside. And because of my life experience, I straddle the outside and the inside. I spent decades outside government and the private sector, campaigning for social justice, working alongside poor people in Bosnia, working alongside marginalised women in some of the poorest neighbourhoods in the United Kingdom. Some years later, after some other responsibilities, including running a private sector firm, I came to be appointed in open competition as a specialist advisor to the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government under one British government. And I was one of only two across all of government that was then kept on by the next administration as an advisor, moving from being the advisor around faith and social inclusion to working with the Minister for Cities and Decentralisation, driving the decentralisation of power out of our central system and towards the localities. And then in a third administration, was then taken back in to work on disability inclusion. And I suppose I read Fratelli Tutti as a Catholic on the one hand, but then on the other hand, as someone that was working in a government body that didn't talk about being a Catholic day in, day out, and would have seen this as an interesting think tank contribution, as interesting as the one that came out from the Urban Institute the day before, the Adenauer Foundation the day after that created a storm for 3 or 4 days, that an enthusiastic minister might encourage several officials to read, then which would sort of fizzle into the distance, except in the debates of the incredibly enthusiastic. So I went looking for patterns in the document that might be recognisable to a policymaker in order to be able to translate it outwards, before then seeking to look back inwards on what might be something creative that we could draw from it. I think, to use World Economic Forum language, and the Pope has been there. The Pope in the document identifies a number of megatrends, and the bottom left-hand corner of my slide there are some pretty standard megatrends that you would find in megatrends presentations in World Economic Forum and other gatherings. So the Pope's concerned that we're globalizing at pace and that we don't have a planned roadmap. He's concerned at the sudden and unexpected emergence of pandemics and other calamities, and their lack of sense of history or historicity, or their placing in a context of memory of hope. He's concerned about the absence of human dignity in general, but particularly on the borders of countries, and a rise of a kind of an unhealthy populism that can be aligned with that. And then, as our chairman said tonight, he expresses grave reservations about the illusion of communication. So he, I'll just get the right slide. So beyond his mega trends, he identifies some mega problems. The shattered dreams of integration and collaboration. For example, the extent to which the European Union is still working hard to achieve the pooled sovereignty that so many of its Catholic founders had. And he flags again there the Patria Grande, really common as a rallying call amongst South American bishops and a certain class of South American, but not really so common these days amongst South American policy leaders, democratic movement, and those outside elite circles. He laments the decline in historical consciousness, because without historical consciousness we have no roots and we don't belong anywhere. And then laments a kind of a rise, cultural colonization, which you could call consumerism, individualism, and its devastating impacts on local cultural forms. And then the insufficient recognition in the global and international system of universal human rights. So far, so good. So far, actually, so typically, Pope Francis, repeating themes that he's expressed in many sermons, and you can see that in the footnotes, referring to Catholic Bishops' Conference around the world, but some innovations too. So innovation number one, as far as I can establish, is it's the first social encyclical to refer directly to interreligious dialogue, and almost kind of hinting that his friendship with the religious leadership in the United Arab Emirates has some similarities and kinship with St. Francis's relationship with Sultan Malik al-Kamil in the 12th century. It's the first social encyclical, I think, that I can find that quotes Protestant sources, and he formally excludes the death penalty. But aside from these innovations and his creative and passionate reassertions of social justice worldview, of a Pope Francis worldview, how innovative and how helpful is the encyclical in helping us actually to concretely challenge some of the great evils that we might need to defeat today, even some of the trends that he identifies as being at risk. And to assess this, it seems to me it's very significant that he made the journey to Assisi. It's the birthplace of the saint who dreamt that he should prepare the church, as well as develop inventive and creative new ways of missioning to societies. It's the place where the Franciscan family is connected emotionally right across the planet. It's a place where he earned himself legitimacy in this encyclical by going there, to be able to quote from St. Francis, to be able to draw on that inspiration, and to be able to give that image. But conceivably, the reading of St. Francis that we get in the encyclical isn't very Franciscan. It's a Franciscan, an un-Franciscan, Francis maybe. There are more citations in the text from St. Thomas Aquinas and of Jesuit theologians than there are from any Franciscan sources. It refers to the possibility that Francis became a father because he reached out to the poor, meaning a father to the weak, a father, benevolent carer to those beneath him. And actually, In insisting that we're all brothers, St. Francis subverted fatherliness, perhaps subverting it even further by rejecting the wealth of his own father, rejected ordination, remaining deacon. He actually became a brother, and he did that in partnership with others, which I'm going to touch on in a moment. And it seems to me that one thing that might be underdeveloped in the encyclical, and these are not criticisms, these would be, what could we add if we were trying to take it from 7 out of 10 to 10 out of 10? Specificity, what Duns Scotus might call hexaity, much more of a concrete view on the application of love in strands of Franciscan theology, but in mega trends and mega problems, and even in the mega solutions that Francis proposes of a new politics, of a new way of approaching life, aren't to be found. In fact, here are his papal strategic solutions: that we should reimagine social property and that which we think belong to the commons, that we should reimagine formal politics, including through a kind of a social and political charity, that we should reimagine international power, for which reimagine international institutions not far seemingly off where they are at the moment, and that we should recover kindness as embodied in an end to any holy war. But none of the specificity, the hexaity. And one thing seems to me that's missing is the institutional innovation that a true Franciscan spirit brings directly into view. A hierarchical small town of Assisi had the rich at the top, the poor at the bottom. The sewers emptied and went running down to the bottom of the town where the poor lived, and beyond them, those beyond the bottom of the economic pyramid, the lepers. When Assisi went to war, it would be the poor who were killed first. When St. Francis gave away his habit and moved to join the poor at the edge of the city and then beyond the city, he also called into question the shape of the church, as well as the whole shape of the society in which he was. Franciscans, and to an extent the Dominicans, moved to the great new urban centres, to the cities, to the rising urban arenas, not with monasteries on their back, not with heavy buildings, but with the light foot of the mendicant preacher, living, sustaining, preaching by word and deed alongside the weakest. So when Pope Francis goes to Assisi, how Franciscan is he? Actually, if we get to the heart of Saint Francis and the deep and radical commitment to love and to the particular forms by which we need to build love, including through institutional innovation and the inclusion of all of humanity and creation in that project, perhaps we point actually to something a bit deeper, a bit broader, and a bit more radical than the Holy Father has pulled off in the encyclical. Because a question that we need to ask, given the life and ministry and partnership of St. Francis in mission, is where is St. Clare in this cyclical? Now, I'm not going to go on to a big critical assessment from a feminist perspective, but even telling the Franciscan story is almost impossible without the story of St. Clare. It is impossible, really, without the story of St. Clare. If one wants to draw on the spirit of the Franciscan world, we need to recognize that today there are 20,000 male Franciscans ordained, 200,000 Franciscan women in the Poor Clares, and 1 million Franciscan women and lay Franciscans in the Third Order. So not only did Francis partner with Clare, talk to a fox, and walk with the lepers who were the outside of the beyond of the day, but the institutional forms to which he gave birth were never, right from the outset, confined to one particular part of humanity. And not only that, but something perhaps that we miss in that language of Francis, that Pope Francis uses, is the absolute fragility of that saint, and the extent to which, when he walked with the poorest, that was not simply the wealthy man coming out of the wealthy household to go and be benevolent and to make a journey to help the poor person. It was the guy recovering from his experiences of war that probably had a mental breakdown. The guy who set off the first time to go to the Crusades, who couldn't make it and came home in breathtaking embarrassment amongst all of his friends, and so was left to wander for a long time in a fragile space. And from that was born not only his mission and his vision, but all of these institutions, a certain agency and the fragility, which perhaps is unremarked upon by Pope Francis so far in what he's written. And why do I think that's critical? Well, I think it's critical because I think if we stop and we look at fragility and agency, and we stop and we look at who might be missing from a description of mission, we not only clock that Clare wasn't there, we then begin to identify some trends of our own, some unexpected challenges of our own, and some members, some brothers and sisters of the planet, that social teaching in general, and this particular cyclical in particular, struggle to really get their heads down, and so to inspire concrete action on the part of the church and practical, critical reflection on the part of policymakers. So it would be hard to find anything detailed reference to Africa in reading the encyclical. In fact, as one reads it, one feels that one's reading a dialogue between Europe, South America, and to an extent America, between that competition of capitalisms. Because if you look at hyperconnectivity and you say that it's absolutely dreadful, just as an example, you can get what the Pope might be saying, and kids spend all of their time online. If I'm in a village, 7 hours walk from the nearest phone, and a cloud computing solution has given me text and banking and health and medical access for the first time at the bottom of the economic pyramid and beyond the bottom of the economic pyramid in great swathes of Africa, hyperconnectivity is a beautiful thing to be encouraged. And Africa's not a small thing in the church at the moment, even though in Rome it's sort of parked in a strange congregation only for Africans and other people considered not to be as wise as the rest of us. There are 1.2 billion people there, 200 million Catholics, which is up 383% in 15 years, and is expected to double again by 2050. And it's an urbanizing context as well as a rural one. And in that sense takes part in this new mega change that's happened across the planet, which is that by 2018, more than half the planet is living in a city. Lagos in Nigeria will soon leap from 60 million to 100 million. So that's more people in one city in Nigeria than there are in people in UK and some. And Johannesburg will join Karachi and others in the leagues of the mega cities. And although we talk about Africa being a young continent, there are 40 million people over 60 in Africa, and that's set to rise to over 160 million. And on this continent are the really raw, or many of the really raw node points of the kinds of tension spots that the Holy Father refers to. The raw node points between the rising Catholic community and a kind of a prosperity and fundamentalist Pentecostalism, Africanized and hyper-entrepreneurial, and then their relationship with Islam in a variety of forms right across the continent. And then their encounter in turn, and very interesting given the Holy Father's insistence on the universality of human rights, their encounter in turn with the People's Republic of China, recognized by the Holy See diplomatically, but handing out technology across the continent, which is helping the 54 countries of Africa to leapfrog over some of the challenges that previous generations faced, whilst at the same time being handed cybersecurity standards and levels of indebtedness and state and community borrowing and skill swapping that conceivably puts their security in the very fullest sense of the word at some kinds of risks. So cities and Africa rising doesn't seem to me to come through powerfully enough in what the Pope has said to date in general, or to ask that question about where the new friars and sisters are. And by that, I don't only mean the people in habits, I mean all of us who are brothers and sisters to each other and to creation. And this applies, seems to me, to a group that papacies struggle with, which is disabled people in general, and within those who live with mental wealth, or what you might call mental health challenges. The only time I can find in the encyclical a reference to anything related to disability is when the Pope is talking about the deafness of able-bodied people to all sorts of social trends and social needs. It doesn't actually celebrate those who struggle to hear. The only time I've been able to find reference in papal literature to schizophrenia, to psychosis as a severe form of mental illness, is when Pope Benedict and Pope Francis refer to those who are spiritually inconsistent as schizophrenic. Now, schizophrenics are about just under 1/5 of humanity. The occurrence of schizophrenia is directly related to trauma, and of hearing voices and psychosis directly related to trauma and to social challenges early in life, can be well managed, can be well treated, but then its endurance and the extent to which it whittles away at the life and the celebration of an individual, their families, their carers and their community, significantly dictated by access to health services. But what of other disabled people? That'd be about 30 to 40% of humanity, with, in Europe, that number going up. Because when the pro-life cause has been successful in defending the right of mothers and fathers to use good health services to make sure that their early born children survive, works out. That often works out where the children continue to have disabilities later in life, and so the numbers, particularly in the younger end, are increasing. Not only in that end. What are those in the institution of the church and in the institution of societies near you and beyond? In Zambia, there's one psychiatrist for the whole country. In Rwanda, there is one hospital that covers off every learning disability as well as every mental health challenge in the whole country. It's funded by a religious order from Belgium, bless them. But these are not, these disabled people, objects in the main of pity, objects to be treated with benevolence, objects to be invited to a mass for the sick or a day for the isolated, because they have a certain agency. In Britain, it's estimated that the purchasing power of disabled people is £249 billion. Compare that to the total economic contribution of the Anglican Church or church buildings at about £12.2 billion. China is so excited that the market for assistive tech to empower disabled people to take part in the economy, to take part in society, is going to become so big that it estimates that its own assistive tech market is going to be £100 billion. The US market 2 to 3 times that size. And it's been investing in creating specialized tech parks in its emergent cities to meet that market need. So if we're all brothers and sisters, what does that look like in society? And actually, if we're all brothers and sisters, what does it look like if canon law continues to exclude from ordination those with physical disabilities, and in the previous code of canon law went even further still to exclude them from being present on the altar in any way? Why is it the case that I might be able to survive the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, having had my arms chopped off by some guerrilla group, and then aged still only 21, be refused for being applied to seminary or for a leadership position because I have no arms, because I'm disabled? Why should it be that I can come back from serving my country in Iraq or Afghanistan or some other place and be living with some kind of traumatic experience, and to find that that's grounds for caution being applied vis-a-vis my application to seminary? We're all brothers and sisters, and we all belong, and we're inspired by a fragile saint. How are we interested in the fragile? How are we truly interested in those with agency from those communities? And these folk do have agency. I spent much of last year undertaking field work in the villages of Rwanda. And in Rwanda, there were 250,000 rapes during the genocide, giving rise to 20,000 children of rape. 38,000 of them live in government community centres, 135,000 living in foster families. Genocide shredded public services, it shredded the position of the local female poor. And yet they dig every day, and they collaborate every day, and they work together every day to make a living. They have an agency, and it's an agency which is informed and sustained by their love of the church, as well as the honour in which they hold their presence. And that's why we need to celebrate the agency of survivors and the soft vengeance of those who endure. The woman who in Kigali explained to me that she had had 8 children, and during the genocide, which by the way wasn't an ethnic conflict, it was a conflict generated by conflict between 2 groups who'd been driven to become distinct because of past laws invented by white fathers coming from Belgium, who in turn have been inspired by European eugenic studies, to radically differentiate the Hutu and the Tutsi, and to create a situation where just before the genocide, the Archbishop of Kigali was on the committee that was steering what became the genocide, the central committee of the party. So this woman in her village, telling me about her journey, she'd lost 7 of her 8 children, they'd been hacked to death in front of her, and she'd been set fire to. She'd recovered, and she carried on working with her 8th child. Because he was overweight, or as she said, because he was fat, he had an ordinary heart attack. And this time her trauma came flooding back. And after 4 or 5 years living in toilets and latrines, she was taken in by a church charity and is now in a specialist centre run by the First Lady of Rwanda. And she described to me the sheer beauty of a shower. Why? Because when she was burnt, her arms had sealed shut on the scars of the burns. And what they'd been able to do after 26 years was operate to give her her arms back. Throughout that period, she'd cultivated, sold things, bought things, survived. Rape survivors do it day after day. They're the bravest people you can possibly imagine, taking one step at a time. And in Pakistan, there is a huge socially innovative, powerful network called Seed, which has kick-started hundreds and hundreds of organisations founded and run by disabled people, driving thousands of them back into the marketplace. Now, why is this critical in the context of the encyclical? The Holy Father talks of the Good Samaritan. And he talks of how the Good Samaritan helps. And he talks of how the Good Samaritan is a model to inspire us. And he develops that story of the Good Samaritan. Well, I was reminded of Mrs. Thatcher saying the important thing about the Good Samaritan was he had money in his pocket. And I didn't want to take that seriously, but I was also thinking that someone else lamented that the 2 people actually benefit from that situation is the Good Samaritan and the innkeeper. And you can see that in the Holy Father's celebration of the Good Samaritan, because the Good Samaritan seems to come out of the whole experience as the good man better than the subject or the object of his philanthropy. And the potential agency in the future of that person who might have been disabled, who might have been old, who might have had power to be unlocked, seems to be absent. And so one's left with the impression that what was important, the margins of the innkeeper and the good name of the Good Samaritan. And what's lost in the telling of the story is a sense of agency, a sense of which ideas transport and whose justice and which side we might need to be on. So it seems to me that that needs to be strengthened in the future. And if we're to be brothers and sisters, truly brothers and sisters, we need to concretely institutionalize that in the same way that St. Francis, rather chaotically at first, gave birth to a series of new institutions with new legs. On local scale, this is the reverse of an unhealthy globalization, can be replicated. The Pears Foundation, which is a Jewish philanthropic institution in London, was very anxious that lots and lots of non-profits were coming to it, asking for office spaces. So it created an office centre where they could all have a hub with free offices in it. Some of us copied that idea and, using an empty building next to a cathedral, created a place where the old and the young, those who'd been through a traumatic divorce or cancer, or who were living with disabilities, could come and own and run and launch their own firms. We created a new apostolate in the church called the volunteer of the apostolate of mentoring from the congregation, as a new way of giving to the life of the church. So instead of only going to the finance committee or the dining club of the Catholic Great and the Good, a new way of giving away your time and talent was to mentor young startups. For example, one of those has gone on to launch a social bank called Street, which has lent, getting on for £750 million. And he in turn was inspired by an initiative in Vienna, co-founded by Caritas Austria and by the Erststiftung in Vienna, where the foundation, which owns a certain lump of the equity in the bank, recognized that as the bank closed at 3 o'clock every day, and so wasn't using all of its assets in the evenings. So it used the existing branch structure to create the second savings bank, using volunteers from all of the banks to open a second bank for the unbanked, for the poorest, using the existing branch structure to cut the costs. That's been so successful, it's taken thousands of people back into banking, out of debt, and enabled them to take out their first mortgage and their first rent, and to get back into the workplace. And then at the other end of things, the Franciscan Sisters of Mary and the Franciscan Mothers of Divine Motherhood, the Franciscan Sisters of Mary and St. Louis over in Connecticut, and the Franciscan Mothers of Divine Motherhood in the UK, looking at some of their assets, looking at some of the earnings of the sisters over many generations, have said, we won't simply give money away, although we might, but we will also invest. And we won't just choose what not to invest in, but we will choose, for ethical reasons, for environmental reasons, for socially just reasons, what we will invest in, so that our investment not only gives us a return, but also drives social change. And that so changed the worldview of the Franciscan Sisters of Mary that when they said that they wanted to do something for the environment, they went to the big meetings of all of the famous Catholic philanthropic foundations, and they asked about the environment and found them perplexed. It's not really a mainline Catholic thing, is it? So they then went to all of the environmental organizations and discovered that they were dominated by white professors in their early 50s, like me. And so they ended up making a long-standing investment to two of the poorest neighborhoods in America, where 90% of the population is black, and where the environmental degradation is absolutely breathtaking because of the behavior of local corporates. And on the back of the funding that they provided to black communities, they've environmentalized, they've mainlined environmental activism into the community and powerfully mitigated the abuses of those firms in those localities. Local scale and creativity can be really powerful and can be replicated.
Sorry, Francis, to interrupt you, but we are short on time.
So you have
two minutes left. Thank you.
Yeah. And so it seems to me that we need to identify an Assisi 1000, a series of new institutions that we back and we support, and that we take the rich ethic of St. Francis to make everybody a brother and sister, to found new institutions, and to pay attention to the particular and not just great big normative megatrends, to reinvent and to recapture with ideas and brothers and sisters coming from absolutely everywhere. Thanks for listening. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Francis, for this lecture on Fratelli Tutti. I wonder whether you provoked some questions with our audience, so please feel free to answer the question. I have a look at the chat. I don't see any questions coming in right now, so I feel free to ask you a first question, Francis, namely, is your discussion now mainly about the debate between justice and love? And isn't it so that the Benedict option, so to speak, was rather that the church has to deal with charity, love, charity? And isn't it so that Francis is more opting for structures, whereas you seem to criticize this a little bit? I misunderstand this.
Yeah, so I think the Benedict option is charity. The American option is pure markets. Yeah, and Pope Francis is pointing towards structures, and he has a point to make about the weaknesses of economic structures, and particularly of market behaviors. But it seems to me that the analysis isn't nuanced enough because it's too general. And so it doesn't adequately recognize that structural injustice is driven, and this is where the African experience is critical. It's driven by urban bias, domination in public spending of urban arenas. It's dominated by kleptocratic behaviors of bureaucracies. It's dominated by failures in conflict resolution by global institutions that he wants to encourage. And it's compromised and extended by failures of institutional innovation and inclusion by the church. So I think he's gone half of the way there by pointing to some of the failures of market structures. He's not looked at the rest of the institutions that make up society that can also drive inequality, injustice, and brotherhood and sisterhood even more quickly than the markets that he and some of those who've been really celebrating this encyclical love.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Oh yes, I see Helen Alford here. I am looking for those questions, but I can't find them.
In answer to what Helen's just asked, Helen Alford's just asked, is not that not only is there not an audit, but that the Pope in this encyclical has done an audit. He's named his mega trends, he's named his mega problems, and the audit that he's done captures the back end of European experience, is severely shaped by some arguments in America and especially South America, and misses Asia and especially Africa. And that is a structural weakness in the Catholic social teaching tradition of the church in general and of the encyclical in particular.
Then there is the question of Jeff Fountain from Amsterdam. He says Corona is in the background of this encyclical, but could you talk more specifically about it? How is Corona in the background of this encyclical?
Yeah, I think he's so he refers to the unexpected pandemic. And this points to another gap, which I've skipped over, which is that anybody working on health equity and health equality globally has been predicting pandemics for the last 25 years. And they've been predicting those pandemics to come from the problem of high blood pressure and obesity on the one hand, but also from infections such as this. So the reason why the current governor of New York has been so quick at responding to coronavirus is because Ebola made it from West Africa to New York State while he was the governor, and they had to lock down parts of New York State. Yeah, there are 3 other versions of coronavirus moving around the region. One of them is as a result of transfer from camels to humans, and in that community, that health community, they've been predicting these pandemics. So it seems to me the best way to look at the pandemic is not to say this is in the background of Tutti Fratelli, but actually the fact that it might be referred to as being in the background or unexpected also calls into question some of the analysis, because health inequality and the likelihood of a jump from an animal to a human illness, then out of Africa or out of Asia into the rest of the world, has been predicted and mainstream and been right at the heart of arguments, say at Yale Health School, at Harvard Medical School, at Leuven Medical School for up to three, 4 decades. And the church in its analysis, and for that matter, most of the West, has just ignored it.
One of the surprising things also is that corona is but one of the 3 viruses the Pope mentions. That's also very surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond that. It's only there are more than 3. Every time some logs get cut down, some more animals run into the Madagascar cities.
Helen Alford is continuing on the previous question. She calls for a Pope doing a global audit and a Pope using more bishops' conferences and churches becoming doing more local stuff. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's why you do the local stuff. Okay, so it seems to me what's missing is not an audit, but it's a global Catholic social innovation laboratory. So to describe that at a much smaller scale, if one went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, the Ash Institute for Public Innovation as a global database where to its subscribers, it writes up, it evaluates, it describes ways that public institutions have successfully challenged, mitigated, and addressed failed social questions. And it seemed to me that what one could do is gather 1,000 examples, 2,000 examples that have been thoroughly evaluated across the planet. And one could put those together on a global innovation database. And because we're the church, we give that away to the planet as a series of models that people can do. And then what we would then do in drawing on them is not think of ourselves as doing a locally managed project by a local bishop, worried about authority and the locality and the control of it, but creating a social innovation to demonstrate in London that it can work in Brussels, and a social innovation in Kigali to demonstrate that it could work in New York. And then we become truly Eucharistic, truly brothers and sisters, because we're calling on the energy of all of the brothers and sisters of God, not just the men, not just the able-bodied, not just those in Europe, Latin America, and America.
Thank you. I come back to Helen Alford once again, and it's a rather methodological question. Don't you think the church has a much broader problem? One of the reasons that the audit before the encyclical isn't global is that we don't have a proper institutional or organizational structure to supply it. Do you agree with that? Because I would think the church is tangled in the smallest village in the world, so to speak, of course. So this question rather comes as a surprise to me, but...
So I think there might be a compelling argument to create, alongside, say, the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and the Dicastery for Integral Development, an evidence lab to take the data from the church to be able to unlock the potential of some of the social challenges being faced. But I think actually it would need to go further than that. And I'm thinking here of the experience. I've recently been chairing finance for a £400 million health organisation, working with some of the most vulnerable people in our country. And you can have the best evidence in the world, but if the public body 1 mile away has a different information protocol and you can't share that data, all of the learning is lost. So if one was going to create such a lab, probably there'd have to be a requirement that bishops, diocesan bodies, Catholic charities doing social justice work across the planet were required to share their learning and were required to share some of their evidence so that those global protocols could unlock collaboration in a fresh way. At the moment, if I'm from England and I want to go fundraising in an American diocese, I have to ask permission of the Americans. And I'm sure that if I was going to send some information to a global database in Geneva or Rome, my bishop would have to say yes. If my bishop didn't understand it, then Helen or anybody else wouldn't get their data in Rome.
Thank you, Francis. Are there any other questions? Perhaps
Everybody.
Perhaps a last remark then on my side. I was rather shocked, yes, by the exegesis of Samaritan by the Pope, because on the Good Samaritan, books and libraries have been written, and the Pope just says, listen, the meaning is very simple: you help or you don't. Or did I misunderstand him?
I understood him as saying, as you help or you don't, and that the real center of that story is the person that helps. I suppose when I read the Good Samaritan, I always want to ask myself, why was he attacked? Was it Islamophobia these days? Was it because he was disabled? Was it because he was homeless and he smelt? Was it because he was Jewish? Yeah. And that in turn then tells me something about the appropriate strategy for helping it. I once very funnily heard a politician say that if he'd been the Good Samaritan, he would have only given the poor person a grant on condition that he agreed to some performance criteria for the next 3 weeks on how he would individually improve his life. And then I've been in other contexts where black churches automatically assume that the victim that the Good Samaritan helps is a black woman excluded from a bus, or a black woman told not to get on the train in apartheid South Africa. So it seems to me that the Pope has just read that one very easily, very quickly, and not drawn out of it what he could. But he also starts by saying that this is a story that we all know. And there's a very talented Dutch Dominican called Richard Steenvoorde. And I'll never forget the day that he arrived in Manchester with me, and we went to one of the very largest Catholic schools in the inner city area to run a workshop on social justice. And Richard, with 300 black Catholic students in front of him, all aged 17 or 18, said, we're going to work with the Good Samaritan because it's a story you'll all know. And you know what? Nobody in that room had ever heard of the Good Samaritan. So I think there's also a generational thing about which stories work, which ones people are familiar with, and then how you interpret them for the modern times.
Before we close down this session, a last question from the Antwerp professor Hendrik Ottebeke. Do you think that this encyclical is written in such a way that it really helps to develop a constructive dialogue also with non-believers? Can you tell something more about this topic?
Again, dialogue with? I lost you for a second.
With non-believers, yes. That it helps to develop a constructive dialogue also with non-believers.
Yeah, so this is why I wouldn't want to be interpreted as saying, as I'm criticizing this, I'm saying that this is a wonderful first step, but we forgot some of the partners we need to bring with us. But this is a document that I can take to my local mosque, and I can sit with my friends, my brothers and sisters friends in the Muslim community, and we can talk through together. It's one that definitively condemns anti-Semitism. In a Europe where anti-Semitism is on the increase, it's one that I can take to the synagogue or sit with the Association of Jewish Youth and talk through it. So I think that is all positive. When it comes to externals, when it comes to people of the common good, I still think it's a moot point as to whether any encyclical is really addressed to those beyond the church. So will it work with those beyond the church? Come back and ask me in 5 years' time, because I'll certainly be trying it with the environmental movement. And their first question will be, yes, but does he change policy on population? And then with the human rights movement, yes, but has he changed his policy on China? So maybe it will work. And I'll tell you in 5 years' time, Hans.
You'll come back in 5 years. Thank you very much, Francis, for this enlightenment of the encyclical. I am glad to thank you also on behalf of all the participants. And now I would like to return the floor to the director of AXIA, Stijn Latry.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you so much Professor Davies, for this insightful comments on the encyclical. I think we'll have plenty of time in the coming months and even years to comment and to deepen the comments even on this encyclical. So that is work in progress, as we have seen with Laudato Si as well. So for now, I thank you all. I thank the audience, and I see you back at some other occasion in the Fuchsia U-turn. Bye and fine evening. Ciao.
God bless.